Hey, good morning. I do know everybody here. Good to see you all again, friends. Great to have you here today. Tomorrow, Janet and I will be married 40 years. I can hardly believe it. We're going to show you what we were like at the beginning. And this is the era that is best known for white shoes and belts. But more importantly, Jerry Ford was the president. Apple Computer was founded. And a new house in America on average cost $49,000, which would pay basically for your living room here in our city. Despite what Matthew McConaughey had to say, we pulled the trigger and got married. So we're in the middle of all these arrangements to do our 40th anniversary trip. And we are getting the dog's luggage packed, and we're getting bottled water and snacks to take along, and getting all our clothes organized for Lake Tahoe, which is cold and there's no atmosphere up there. And right in the middle of all of this, I lose my keys. Car keys, house keys, bike lock keys. My whole life is on one little steel ring, and it's just gone, and I am desolate. Because your whole life just grinds to a halt, and despite the fact that your wife has a parallel set of keys, that's not really much comfort, because you don't really have, I can't even check the mail. So we did what we do. We retraced our steps, went back to Emeryville, where I had last used them to lock my bike up, and by the time I got home, they were just gone. And then I went to Barnes & Noble's, where I thought somebody had turned them in. No love there. The mall security office got me all excited because they said, yes, Mr. Creps, we have a set of Volvo keys right here in the office. And it turned out when I got there, they had a set of Volkswagen keys, not Volvo keys. They stopped reading at the V. And I went away even more discouraged than I already was. The only bright spot in this was that I still had a backup bike lock key, because when you can ride, you still have life. And this was great until I lost that. And now I have nothing, so I'm forced to drive an automobile. Have you seen these? They're all over the streets. I'm driving in misery. My carbon footprint is the size of Montana when I'm driving a car, and I'm just totally hating it. And then my wife, who's a genius, says to me, why don't you check with the place where you ride to the most, which is Whole Foods, because I office up there a lot. And I thought, because your husband, your genetic endowment is not to listen to your wife. You're oppositional by nature. When you're a husband, I'm like, I don't know. She's smarter than I am. Should I really listen? But I did. And I called him up, and they said, yeah, I have a bike key. And actually, Jan called him, and it was steel, had a little rubber thing. The description didn't match. But reluctantly, I drove up. And when I walked in, I went to customer service, and they said, oh, we have keys. And they pulled out a little cardboard box brimming with keyless entry systems from all of the other people who had dropped their keys in the parking lot. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with these people? I mean, here's your BMW keys living in this box, and you haven't even bothered to check to see where it might be. I mean, and right on top of it is sitting my bike lock key. And they hand it to me, and I am saved, man, because when you're riding, then you're saved. And as saved as I was, I just couldn't get away from that image of that little box full of all of those key fobs. My mind went to Moses in the basket floating down the Nile. It was like a little paper sarcophagus that was having a funeral for all of these dead automobile dreams. They were like derelict stars lost in the universe and floating around. And I thought about all the other people whose lives came to a hard stop, just like mine did when I lost mine. And with our 40th anniversary on top of this, I couldn't help thinking about being married from this perspective. And we're going to talk about what's probably the future for some of us. If you're married, you're there. If you're not, there's about a 90% chance that you probably will be at some point. And there's a certain sense in which that experience with the little box just sort of, it spoke to me. I just couldn't get away from it. And I was convinced that maybe it's, in a sense, throwing some light on the nature of this relationship, because when you lose your keys, your whole life stops. And when you lose the keys to being a married person, your whole relationship can stop at the same time. And when that happens, that's really, really a tough thing. Now, the people who had lost the keys to this relationship aren't just contemporary 21st century people. They're also ancient people that were in the same situation. First century Palestine, Jesus is traveling around, And he's teaching people really just how to be humans, how to live, and about the coming of the kingdom of God, and his identity as God's son, and what he's offering as the kingdom of God comes upon them. And during one of his travels, he encounters a crowd of people, and among them are professional religionists that we call the Pharisees, and they want to pose hard questions to him, sometimes because they're looking for a little soundbite that will support their own teaching practice, and sometimes because they're looking for a soundbite that they can use to condemn him because they really envy him for his influence and his power. So this day, marriage is on their mind, and they come to him with a pretty pointed question. And as you read this, you can almost hear Matthew McConaughey's voice. And the Pharisees came up to him, Matthew 19, verse 3, and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" And he answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.'" Now, this is a favorite topic for the Pharisees. They were harped on this. And one reason was that in the Palestinian context of the first century, marriage is not really much more than a social obligation. You got to do it. I mean, your mom's on your back, your dad's on your back, continue the family line, extend the family fortune. You really have to do it. And most of the time that marriage is going to be arranged by your parents. So it's something that's sort of imposed on you. I mean, there's no shower, any of this modern romantic stuff. It's a family function, and with very few exceptions, there were people who didn't, but by and large, everybody kind of had to get with the program. Now, the Hebrew Scriptures provided for divorce in the book of Deuteronomy for the cause that the word is used is indecency, which is kind of an open-ended term. And some people heard that word as meaning only if your partner breaks the bond of marriage by committing adultery. It's a very conservative view. And other people heard indecency as whatever. If you find someone you think is more attractive, you can swap in your spouse and get this new spouse, and you're basically good to go as long as you write her a document they called a bill of divorcement. So there was that sort of fire escape, but in the main, you're pretty much expected to do it. Now, the other thing that's happening here in the background of this question is a public event. The local ruler, Herod, who's a regional official, he's representing the power of the Roman Empire over this part of Palestine. He has married his brother Philip's wife. Nice family, huh? And he has done this despite the fact that Philip is still alive. And the wife, Herodias, moves in with Herod, and John the Baptist, who's Jesus' relative who came to announce his coming as Messiah, sees this and does what prophets do. He calls him out on it publicly. He goes right to the regional ruler in public and says, "This is not right. You can't have your brother's wife. No way, man. I don't care what you wrote or you didn't write." And Herodias takes an offense over this. The gospel writer says she has a grudge against John, has him thrown in prison, and ultimately executed. So marriage and divorce is top of mind. This is like the Kardashians having another child. The whole pop culture world of its day is talking about this issue. And so with all of this percolating, it's a perfect time to trap Jesus because everybody's thinking about it. One syllable going wrong or seeming to contradict the law of Moses, and they could bring down thunder and lightning on him, which is why the gospel writer records that they came to test him with this question. This is not hypothetical. This is an attempt to get at him and catch him saying something that he will later regret very, very much. And instead, Jesus does this. He turns the whole thing upside down and offers them another perspective. That's why they hated him, because he just kept doing that. He wouldn't. They said, "Go this way." No. Well, go. No, you need to represent this. No. Here's this other way, this kingdom of God way, this way that's too big for you to take in with your questions. And he says, instead of talking about who can get married and who can be divorced, let's go back to the beginning. How did all this get started? God creates them male and female, calls them out of their families, and joins them together. Let's go back to the beginning. You know, I have to confess to you, about a month ago, Jan and I thought that this year was actually our 39th anniversary. See, 1976 to 2000, the math was too hard for us. We had never sat down and actually counted it up, and so we both felt the same way. We had, good consensus, marital unity, everything was going. And then we realized we are 30 days out from one of the biggest, one-of-a-lifetime events we will ever have. We have not saved $1 or done a day of planning to make this event special in any way. It's really easy to forget how things start. To lose track not just of your beginning year, but your feelings and your heart and what this whole relationship was about way back. Let's go back to the beginning. Now, the Pharisees' question assumes that marriage is formed by people saying special holy words in a special holy building on a special holy event after paying $25,000 for the caterer. And once you've done all of that, you have something called a marriage, because we said the holy stuff, and we've eaten the holy potato salad, and we've taken pictures with mom and dad, and 3,000 selfies that are now posted on Facebook, and this must be a marriage. And what Jesus is saying is, no, that's just a wedding. To understand what a marriage is, let's go back to the beginning, back to the start. How did all this get underway? Marriage stems not from people's saying special words to make a covenant. That's part of it, but that's a step that's later. What's prior is that it stems from God's creative work among people. When God authors the human race, marriage is authored with. It's not that there's pressure to be involved in the relationship. It's like all the Bible says about it, it's never made mandatory. In fact, many parts of the New Testament recommend staying single unless you just can't help it. This is the only accurate way to portray the passages. But when it is that choice for you, and it's right for you, and you feel it's right in that relationship, it comes from a place that's deeper than signing a license, although that's an important part of it, or saying those commitments, that's an important part of it. It comes from something that happened at the beginning. And when your keys are lost, you go back to where you were, not to where you wish you could have been. I had to retrace my steps, going back to the places where the loss might have taken place. Now, the Pharisees took in this new perspective, and they did what Pharisees did. They objected. No matter what Jesus said. It's like living in Berkeley. No matter what you say, someone will object to you. I love this town so much. I've never been anywhere so argumentative. So sometimes I with people, I just don't say anything, because I'm still like I was a debate coach for years, because I just hate to argue. I hate to fight and yelling in coffee houses and back and forth. And this was the environment of his day. Debating was part of the culture. And they said, after hearing what he said about going back to the beginning, and this is really rooted in the character of God and his creation, they said, well, if that's so, why did Moses give us the option of divorcing at all? Pretty sure they've got him on this one now. And the Lord responds just really simply. He says, because you're a bunch of knuckleheads. Well, the technical term is the hardness of your heart, but the meaning is you're a bunch of knuckleheads. In other words, if you guys, this relationship is so much better than the people that try to populate it, we had to leave a fire escape in here someplace, because the world is not a perfect place, and you guys are you're going to get it wrong sometimes. And so the Bill of Divorcement created a document system that was a protection for the woman involved, basically, that she could document that the man had dismissed her and she wasn't essentially a prostitute, or she wasn't the one who was at fault. The man essentially takes the blame for dissolving the marriage. And in the ancient world, doesn't sound like much today perhaps, but that was a step forward for women at that time. And he adds this. He says, look, if you go around divorcing people for any reason other than adultery, and you marry someone else, you've created adultery among yourselves. Because this was the Pharisees' favorite practice. I have a nephew named Seth. He's a cool young guy. Lives out in the Rockies. I was talking to him one day. He's just one of my favorite people. I really like him. We have spiritual conversations sometimes. He's a great guy. And I said, what does marriage mean to the young adult men that you know? This would be people 20-something, 30-something, basically. And without hesitation, he answers and says, my friends are involved in what I would call practice marriage. In other words, they tie the knot with someone as a rehearsal, as a dry run, to see that if it will work. And the way I know that, he says, is that they continue to live exactly the same lifestyle that they lived before the marriage. In other words, they're still dating other people. They're still out in bars. They're still doing the whole single life. There's a lot of great things about the single life. I don't mean it like that, but they're kind of not. They're kind of trying to have both ends and the middle. They're not giving up anything to make the marriage work, and they're very open to relationships with other people. And when they get tired of the one they have, they just trade it in. This is exactly what the Pharisees are doing. And what Jesus is saying to these professional hypocrites is no practice marriages. He's not condemning the practice of divorce per se. He's discouraging it. He's saying there should be a high bar for it. But what he's really condemning is the person who's using that machinery in the law to be able to trade in a spouse for a newer model just because they feel like it. Because of the disrespect that is, not just for women, but for people and for families. He's saying, look, every building needs a fire escape. It's a good idea, but nobody's supposed to live out there. It's an exception, not a rule. So the disciples, the ones he's personally cultivated and trained, they're listening to the argument. They're listening to the debate. And so they come to him now after he's laid all this out and said, well, it's better then that we shouldn't marry at all, isn't it? And what they mean by that is if I can't dump my wife at will, then I'm trapped in this thing and I can't get out. I'm stuck here for life with a rapidly dehydrating spouse, and I have no way to swap her out for a less dehydrated model when I want it. It warms your heart, doesn't it, to know that the disciples were, after years with Jesus, that they're able to come up with stuff like that. It actually makes me feel better about us when I read things like that. And Jesus puts the brakes on this and says, he reverses even their expectations, and he tells them, look, there are people who are called to be single, but not for your terrible reasons. There's all kinds of other good reasons, and the single state, as was his own, is fine, but you're coming up with the wrong reasons to be all of that. The bill of divorcement was just that fire escape. It was not meant to be an open-ended interstate highway out of the relationship. And he uses this phrase, it was not so at the beginning. It was not so at the beginning. If you retrace your steps back to where this relationship came from, not the paperwork, not the ceremony, but the relationship itself, it comes out of the creative mind of God in forming people and creating this, not just as a way of forming families, but as a way of portraying to the world what God's family looks like. So the Old Testament opens with this story of God bringing these first two people together. And the Bible closes with God's people being brought together with Christ, surrounded by wedding imagery. The Hebrew Scriptures are the story of families, basically, formed by marriage, especially the family of Abraham. The New Testament is the story of God's Son. His first miracle is worked at a wedding in a place called Cana. And he teaches, as he walks, that in heaven, we're neither married nor given in marriage. In other words, it's all stopped by death. The relationship is of such profundity, such gravity, is so closely related to the heart of God, that only death ends it. Or the way I like to think of it is when I choose who I marry, I choose the last face I see before I see Jesus. So people ask us sometimes, how do you keep things going for 40 years? From the invention of Apple to iPhone 6S Plus. That's quite a lifespan. From Gerald Ford in the White House to President Obama and whoever follows him. The only answer I can really give you is that you have to go back to the beginning. So Jan and I have worked with a lot of couples who have been hurting over the years. And one of the things that we do in a first meeting with a couple is to ask them a real simple question: what was it that brought you together in the beginning? And oftentimes, there's a smile that breaks through the tension and the sadness of that moment, and they begin to recover some of the memories of why it was they were attracted to each other and what that meant as they formed that original relationship. And often, just as a beginning point, what we advise them to do is to retrace their steps and look for the lost keys. Because chances are they are back at that first place where they first came together, and as they recover that, it's not a magic bullet, but it puts a foundation under the other kinds of work they need to do to help the relationship function. So despite my white belt and white shoes, when I think about our 40 years, I think about loving my wife the first second I saw her. I think about being impressed by her intelligence, musical talent. I think about how just great looking I thought she was. I think about being instantly drawn to her, which is not something I advise that you do. Love at first sight is a bad plan. I just got lucky. But I don't think about what we could have been or who that could have been. Go back to the beginning where everything started. If you're a married person, that's where you have to live, at the beginning. Because that's the place that's closest to how God created us to be a married man and woman, back at the start. And if you're a single person, you're looking for your beginning. You're looking for a beginning that has the elements to it that can be sustainable for a lifetime, knowing that in the end, we're just the wedding planners. God's the one who has invented marriage, and he's asking us to go back to where that started. Lord, we're thankful that you care so much for us today about our future. Whether we're married or single, Lord, whatever our status of life is, your heart for us is the same across the board. And we ask you, God, for everyone who's in this room, that you would give us wisdom all to take next steps in our lives. And whatever those steps would be or whatever the direction is, that you guide them with such clarity that there's no way we can miss what you have for us. We thank you. We pray in Jesus' name. Let's stand together, and the band's going to lead us just a little more music. And if you'd like to have somebody pray with you, we'll be in the back.